Hello, this is Rabbi David Abramson. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Balak. I want to share with you a story from this week's portion, one which is rather well known. After all, everybody has heard about Bilam and his talking donkey. At first glance, this appears to be a simple story, a good guys versus bad guys story with a happy ending for the good guys. But as we'll see, the story is about more than good guys and bad guys and wisecracking livestock. While the Israelites traveled in the Sinai desert for 40 years after leaving Egypt, they encountered other local groups, sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile. The Israelites sometimes clashed militarily with nearby populations, and sometimes they were vanquished by their enemies, while sometimes they were triumphant. At one point, Balak, the Moabite king, was threatened by the Israelites' recent military triumphs, and he devised a plan for defeating the Israelites. He decided to hire a prophet to curse the Israelites. Now, in the ancient Near East, it was believed that certain people had certain extraordinary powers. Some of these people, by reciting certain words or performing certain rituals, could push the hands of the gods, ensuring this or that desired outcome. Balak decided that if he could find a prophet to curse the Israelites, they would be weakened by the curse, and he would be able to defeat the Israelites on the battlefield. He found one such prophet for hire, a man by the name of Bilam. By the way, though the Hebrew text of the Torah renders his name as Bilam, most contemporary biblical translations render it Balaam. There's a complicated explanation for this evolution of certain vowel sounds in biblical Hebrew, but that's not our topic right now. You'll hear me use the Hebrew pronunciation of the name as it appears in the biblical text, Bilam. So Balak decided to hire Bilam to curse the Israelites, and he sent Moabite dignitaries to arrange the deal with Bilam. The night before Bilam was to give his answer to the dignitaries, God appeared to Bilam and asked, "What do these people want of you?" Bilam reported on the contract he had been offered, and God told him, "Lo telech imahem, do not go with them. Lo ta'or et ha'am, you must not curse that people, ki varuchu, for they are blessed." Remember that centuries earlier, when God established the covenant with Abraham, God told Abraham that the treasured nation that would descend from Abraham would be blessed. God said, "Va'avarechecha va'agadala shemecha," I will bless you and make your name great. Further, God promised, "Va'avarecha mevarechecha," I will bless those who bless you, kalelcha aor, and curse those who curse you. And here in our story, God alludes to that promise by forbidding Bilam to curse the Israelites since they are specially blessed by God. Eventually, God does allow Bilam to set out on his journey with the warning, "But whatever I command you, you shall do." As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that Bilam intends to go meet Balak and curse the Israelites. So God sends an angel, literally to block Bilam's path. As Bilam rides on the back of his donkey, the angel stands in the path with a sword in his hand. Ironically, the great prophet Bilam can't see the angel, but Bilam's donkey does see the angel. So the donkey swerves off the road, Bilam beats the donkey and pulls her back onto the road. A little while later, the angel appears again, this time on a narrow road with a stone wall on either side. Again, the donkey doesn't know what to do. She swerves to avoid the angel, and this time Bilam's foot is slightly injured on the wall, and he beats the donkey again. Soon the angel appears a third time on a narrow road with no room on either side for the donkey to swerve. The donkey doesn't know what to do, so she lies down in the middle of the road, and Bilam beats her again. This time the donkey looks up at Bilam and says, "Me asiti lecha, Ki hikitani zeh shalosh regalim. What have I done to you that you have beaten me these 3 times? Bilam responds, you have made a mockery of me. If I had a sword with me, I'd kill you. The donkey retorts, Halo anochi atoncha asher rachavta alai me'odecha ad hayom hazeh. Look, I am the donkey that you've been riding all along until this day. So now the story has a talking donkey. Not only is this donkey able to see the angel, which Bilam is unable to see, the donkey also mouths off to his master. So the story is ridiculing Bilam, the apparently not so successful prophet. Well, eventually Bilam continues on his journey and he meets Balak. He warns Balak, I can utter only the word that God puts in my mouth. Despite this, and perhaps reminded of the fact that Balak had promised him a lot of money, Bilam tries to summon the spirit that will help him curse the Israelites. He tells Balak to build 7 altars. Balak has the altars built and offers sacrificial animals on each, but to no avail. The curses simply will not come out of Bilam's mouth. There are more twists and turns in the story, but eventually it reaches its climax. Vayisa Bilam et einav. Bilam looked up, Vayar et Yisrael shochein lishvatav, and saw Israel encamped tribe by tribe. Vatahi alav ruach Elohim, and the Spirit of God was upon him. Finally the Spirit hits him. Finally he'll be able to curse the Israelites. And what comes out of Bilam's mouth? Not curses, rather blessings, including this well-known verse. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. If you don't recognize this line primarily from here in the book of Numbers, perhaps you recognize it from our prayer books. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael. These are the words we traditionally recite when we enter a synagogue. And so the story has a happy ending. Bilam fails in his mission to curse the Israelites. As a result, Balak is not able to defeat the Israelites in battle, and the Israelites, the good guys in this story, are not harmed. On one level, it's a simple story of God changing the course of events. Bilam, despite his bad intentions, is turned around by God, blessing the Israelites rather than cursing them. And perhaps the simple story has a simple lesson for us, namely God's influence. Bilam was one of the bad guys in the story, but he ends up doing the right thing. Sure, it's because God forces him to praise the Israelites rather than to curse him, but maybe there's something more here. You and I are not as bad as Bilam. We're generally good, decent people who want to do the right thing and who probably do the right thing most of the time. The lesson then might be being open to God's influence, being receptive to God's gently pushing us in the right direction, hearing God's voice, metaphorically, in our ears. That's a simple yet profound lesson of the story of Bilam. But of course, Jewish tradition sees much more in the story of Bilam. Part of our tradition does view Bilam favorably, reflected not only in the fact that Bilam's words found their way into Jewish liturgy. The rabbis also see something significant in what it was that Bilam saw when he looked out over the Israelite encampment, and why it was that he ended up blessing the Israelites as a result. Ma ra'ah, what did he see? Ra'ah she'ein pitchei oholehem l'chuvonim zeh lazeh. He saw that the entrances of their tents were not aligned with each other. Amar ru'uyin halalu shetishre alehem shechinah. These people are worthy of having the divine presence rest on them. Balaam looks out over the Israelite encampment and sees rows and rows, columns and columns of tents. But the tents are not parallel to each other. Each is skewed slightly so that one family's tent opening doesn't face another's tent opening. Balaam, according to the Talmud, was moved not only by the efficient organization of the Israelites' living quarters, he was moved by the concern for the privacy and dignity of each Israelite family that organization ensured. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. How appropriate it is that the organization of your tents, your dwelling places, is focused on efficiency and effectiveness, but just as importantly, if not more importantly, on moral values as well. Privacy, dignity, these are important, and the arrangement of the Israelite tents protects that. This Talmudic insight speaks to us, I think, not only about our physical dwelling places, but also about our spiritual dwelling places, the institutions of organized Jewish life. Efficiency, effectiveness, budgets, organizational structures, fundraising are all important, but Jewish values, how we relate to one another, how we view one another, are no less the linchpins of Jewish life. Balaam sees that the Israelite community is physically organized in such a way that the privacy and dignity of Israelite families are safeguarded, and Balaam, to his credit, takes note of this fact, and that's what moves him to bless the Israelites. And yet, much of our tradition views Balaam quite negatively. The Talmud further lowers our estimation of Balaam the prophet in one interpretation of the phrase, Vayasem Adonai davar befi Balaam. Adonai put a word in Balaam's mouth, a phrase which we would ordinarily see as one which is complimentary of the prophet. Yet, according to Rabbi Yochanan, even this statement doesn't say anything particularly positive about Balaam. God put God's words in Balaam's mouth, Rabbi Yochanan says, like a hook in the mouth of a fish, which, as Rashi explains, prevented Balaam from saying anything other than what God wanted him to say. Rabbi Yochanan is suggesting that Balaam deserves no credit for his blessing the Israelites. Like a fish on a hook, he was simply forced by God to say what God wanted him to say. Throughout rabbinic literature, Balaam is called Balaam Harasha, Balaam the evil one. The Mishnah tells us that 3 prominent kings and 4 prominent commoners, all mentioned in the Bible, were so notorious that ein lahem chelek la'olam haba, that they have no share in the world to come. And one of those 4 commoners, seen as so evil that he won't get into heaven, is Balaam Harasha, Balaam the evil one. The Talmud even offers a couple of puns to describe Balaam's evil. Balaam, below Am. The name Balaam sounds like the phrase below Am, which means without a nation. Balaam will be without a nation because he won't get into heaven, he won't be with the Israelites and with the other good people who will be in heaven after they die. Davar acher, alternatively, Balaam shebilah am. Balaam, who wore down the Israelite nation. And finally, we are reminded of the fact that Balaam's name is Balaam ben Beor, Balaam the son of Beor. And so what pun do the rabbis create from the name of his father Beor? Sheba al Be'ir, Balaam who engaged in bestiality. And we thought all Balaam did to his donkey was to beat her when she swerved off the road. So the question remains, why is Bilam so badly treated by Jewish tradition? He was, after all, a prophet. Even though he was a non-Israelite prophet, he was a prophet. Even if his intentions weren't so good, one could argue, God did give him the gift of prophecy. And it was this prophetic spirit that finally led him to praise Israel. And if God chose to bestow upon Bilam the gift of prophecy, how can we criticize Bilam? Well, perhaps the real significance of the story of Bilam is to provide a stark contrast between the prophets of Israel and those of the other nations. As one reads various commentaries to the story of Bilam, one sees that this very contrast is a recurring theme among many rabbinic sources. How were the prophets of Israel different from a heathen prophet like Bilam? One classical rabbinic opinion is that Bilam was a greater prophet than Moses himself. Unlike Moses, who had to wait for God to communicate when and as God saw fit, Bilam was able to summon divine communication at will. However, this presents one of the significant ways in which Bilam was inferior to the prophets of Israel. The Israelite prophets didn't seek their jobs as prophets. Their missions were divinely assigned. In some cases, the prophets tried unsuccessfully to escape their divine missions. Bilam, on the other hand, was a professional prophet, a prophet for hire. He made his living by claiming to be a transmitter of divine communication. He would prophesy for anyone who paid him. The cause was irrelevant. The client was irrelevant. Whoever could pay the fee could enjoy the benefits of Bilam's prophecies. The prophets of Israel, on the other hand, always stressed the divine source of their messages. They never claimed to be speaking simply on behalf of themselves. Biblical prophetic literature is full of phrases such as Vayhi Devar Adonai Elai Lemor, the word of Adonai came to me saying, or Ko Amar Adonai, thus says Adonai. While the prophets of Israel were careful to repeatedly emphasize the divinity of their message, Bilam emphasized his own role as messenger. In his elaborate instructions to Balak, Bilam stresses his own initiative. Ve'elecha ula yikare Adonai likrati. I will go, perhaps as a result of my initiative, Adonai will come to meet me. Or, Hityatsev ko al olatecha. Stay here beside your offerings, ve'anochi ikareko, while I seek a manifestation of God over there. In his exchange with God, according to one midrash, Bilam displays similar chutzpah. When the Moabite dignitaries first come to Bilam, God asks him, Mi ha'anashim ha'ela imach? Who are these men with you? One would expect, the midrash tells us, that Bilam would respond with some humility. Why do you ask me, God, when after all you know everything? Instead, Bilam says, Balak ben Zippor melech Moab shalach elai. Balak, the son of Zippor, the king of Moab, sent them to me. The Midrash sees this as an ungrateful and disrespectful attitude before God, the source of Bilam's prophetic gift. You may not call on me for important tasks, but the kings of the world do. Even his prophecies that praise the God of Israel begin with self-serving introductions. Ne'um Bilam beno ve'or, the word of Bilam, the son of Beor, Ne'um hagever shetum ha'ayin, the words of the man whose eye is true. The most significant contrast between Bilam and the prophets of Israel, it seems to me, is presented by a midrashic collection called Midrash Tanchuma. Re'eh ma bein nevi'ei Yisrael linvi'ei ha'umot. Look at what a difference there is between the prophets of Israel and the prophets of the other nations. Kol hanevi'im hayu b'midat rachamim al Yisrael ve'al umot ha'olam. All the Hebrew prophets had a merciful attitude toward both Israel and the nations of the world. Sheken Yeshayahu Omer, for so did the prophet Isaiah say, Al kain me'ai lemo'av kichinur yehemu v'gomer. Therefore my heart throbs for Moab like a harp. Now remember, Balak, the king of Moab, was the enemy of the Israelites in our story. And yet the prophet Isaiah expressed empathy for the Moabites. Unvi'e umot ha'olam, but the foreign prophets, hayu b'midat achzariot, were so cruel, shezeh amad la'akor uma shlema, that this man Bilam rose up to uproot the whole nation, chinam, without cause, well, except for the money he was going to receive, al lo davar, for nothing. This non-Israelite prophet Bilam was so cruel that he was ready to curse the Israelites and thereby destroy the Israelites simply for the fee that Balak had offered him. The prophets of Israel were anguished spirits, often torn between their loyalty to God and their loyalty to Israel. The prophet not only censures and accuses, writes Abraham Joshua Heschel, he defends and consoles. When they castigated the people for their corruption and predicted their impending suffering, the biblical prophets wept for their people. They cared passionately for God. They cared passionately for people as well. Bilam, on the other hand, was an insensitive, self-serving man who used his divine gifts callously. It was no merit of his own that caused him to praise Israel. It was simply that hook in his mouth that forced him to utter those words, and he spoke them, according to our tradition, without feeling or caring. The story of Bilam, then, forces us to consider the contrast between him and the exalted prophets of Israel, to consider what is most significant in biblical prophecy and what should be most significant in our lives as well. Feeling, empathy, caring. If Bilam is presented to us as a negative role model, then it is so that we can be inspired by the Israelite prophets, inspired by their words and inspired by their lives. Shabbat Shalom.